Maryland, USA, the 14th of May, 1945. The air inside the communal latrine smelled primarily of pine disinfectant and the sharp, metallic tang of rust. Helga stood frozen in the third stall, her hands trembling as she clutched the small, rectangular object against her chest. It was soft, encased in pristine gauze, and impossibly white. Outside the thin wooden door, the murmur of other women speaking low German mixed with the squeak of boots on concrete. Helga's breathing hitched. She had expected interrogation. She had prepared for starvation. She had not prepared for this specific, humiliating abundance. "Is everything all right in there?" The voice was American, brisk but not unkind. It belonged to Lieutenant Miller, the camp nurse who had distributed the supplies 10 minutes ago. Helga stared at the object in her hand. In Berlin, they used boiled rags, gray with age and ash. Here, the Americans handed out fresh cotton, as if it were refuse. She didn't know how to attach it. There were no buttons, no belts like the ones back home. Was it a trick? A test of their civility? "I do not know the mechanism," Helga whispered, the English words tasting like ash in her mouth. She pushed the door open. A crack. Miller stood there, holding a blue box with the word Kotex printed in bold letters. The American woman didn't laugh. She didn't mock the filth of the defeated. Instead, she sighed. A sound of weary sisterhood that transcended the barbed wire outside. "It's okay," Miller said, stepping closer and lowering her voice to shield Helga's dignity from the others. "It's just cellulose. Honey, let me show you the loops. You're safe here." Helga looked at the white square, then at the woman who was supposed to be a monster. The hostility she had nursed for years began to fracture, cracked open by a simple, sanitary necessity. If you enjoy historical stories about humanity found in unexpected places, please subscribe and comment which country you are watching from. 6 weeks earlier, approaching the port of Boston, the Liberty ship groaned, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the steel hull and settled deep into Helga's bones. For 14 days, the rhythm had been the same. The pitch of the deck, the retching of seasick women, and the omnipresent smell of diesel fuel mixed with unwashed bodies. Helga sat wedged against a rusted bulkhead in the cargo hold, her knees pulled to her chest. Around her, 200 other women, nurses, auxiliaries, and clerical staff, captured near the Rhine, huddled in the dim light. They were the debris of a collapsing empire, scooped up and shipped across the ocean to an unknown fate. "Helga," a voice whispered from the shadows. It was Greta, a 19-year-old radio operator whose arrogance had evaporated the moment the Americans took her headset. "Quiet," Helga snapped, though she kept her voice low. "Save your energy." She adjusted the collar of her gray uniform. It was stiff with salt and sweat. In her pocket, her fingers brushed against the jagged shard of ceramic she had found in the transit camp in France. A piece of a broken teacup, sharp enough to open a vein if the Americans decided to act like the Soviets were rumored to. The propaganda films had been clear. The Americans were gangsters, mongrels, undisciplined cowboys who would exploit helpless German women. Helga scanned the hold. So far, the exploitation had been absent. There had been no assaults, only a terrifyingly efficient bureaucracy. They had been counted, tagged, deloused with clouds of white powder, and loaded onto the ship like livestock. Indifference, Helga decided, was almost worse than hatred. To the Americans, they were just cargo. The ship's engine slowed to a deep thrum. The heavy iron doors above them clanged open, allowing a blinding shaft of daylight to pierce the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beam, a cruel reminder of the sun. "Everybody up! Let's go! Move it!" The shouts came from above, English words that sounded like barking dogs. Helga helped Greta to her feet. The girl swayed, her face pale green. "Stay behind me," Helga ordered. "Look at the ground. Do not make eye contact." They climbed the metal ladder, emerging onto the deck into the biting wind of the North Atlantic spring. Helga blinked, shielding her eyes. As her vision cleared, her breath caught in her throat. They were not docking at a desolate prison fortress. Beyond the railing, a city sprawled across the horizon, untouched and arrogant. Buildings stood tall and whole. Glass windows glinted in the sun, intact glass, acres of it. There were no craters, no skeletal ruins. Cars moved along the coastal roads in colorful streams. "Look at it," someone whispered behind her. "It's whole." Helga felt a surge of bitter bile. While Berlin burned and her parents likely starved in a cellar, this land sat fat and happy. It was unfair. It was grotesque. "Keep moving." A GI gestured with his rifle barrel, though his finger was outside the trigger guard. He looked bored. He was chewing something gum, rhythmically, his jaw moving like a cow's. They were herded down the gangplank onto the concrete pier. The sensory overload was immediate. The air didn't smell of cordite and rot. It smelled of brine, roasting coffee, and exhaust. A train waited for them, steaming gently. Not a cattle car, Helga noted with a jolt of suspicion, but passenger carriages. Old ones, perhaps, with peeling paint, but they had windows and seats. As they waited in formation on the dock, a truck rumbled past. It was laden with crates. One crate had splintered open, spilling its contents. Oranges. Bright, impossible spheres of orange gold rolled onto the dirty concrete. A GI jogging behind the truck didn't scramble to save them. He kicked one of the oranges aside into the water, laughing as he chased the truck. Helga stared at the floating fruit bobbing in the oil-slicked water. In Germany, a man would have killed for that orange. Here, it was garbage. "Move out." The column marched forward. Helga gripped Greta's arm tighter. The sheer wastefulness of this enemy was terrifying. If they could throw away food, what would they do with human lives? But as they boarded the train, a different anxiety began to coil in Helga's gut, sharper than the fear of execution. She felt the familiar, dull cramp in her lower abdomen, a heaviness in her pelvis. She calculated the dates. The stress of the capture and the voyage had delayed it, but biology was relentless. "No," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes as she sank onto the plush, dusty seat of the train car. Not now. She had nothing, no rags, no scissors to cut her petticoat, no water to wash. She looked out the window as the train jerked into motion, pulling them deeper into the heart of the enemy's land. The American landscape rolled by green, lush, and horrifyingly peaceful. Helga pressed her thighs together. A new, silent battle beginning. A battle for dignity in a land of plenty, where she was about to bleed, and she had absolutely no way to hide it. The trucks rumbled to a halt inside the perimeter fence. Helga jumped down onto the gravel, her legs stiff from the journey. She immediately scanned the surroundings, her eyes narrowing against the afternoon sun. She expected a muddy compound, barbed wire rusted with neglect, and open latrines. That was what a prison looked like. That was what the camps in the East looked like. Instead, Camp Maryland looked like a holiday retreat for the insane. Neat rows of wooden barracks stood on raised platforms, painted a crisp military white. Between them, patches of grass had been mowed with geometric precision. There was barbed wire, certainly, but it looked brand new, glinting silver and taut. "Move into Barracks 4, a guard instructed, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Bunks are assigned." Helga marched her group toward the designated building. "Stay sharp," she hissed to the women behind her. "This is psychological warfare. They want us to relax, so we spill secrets." She pushed open the screen door and stopped dead. The air inside did not smell of mold or damp straw. It smelled of pine cleaner and floor wax. Inside, 20 cots were arranged in 2 perfect lines. Helga approached the nearest one cautiously, as if it might explode. She pressed her hand down on the mattress. It gave way with a soft squeak, then bounced back. Springs, cotton batting, sheets, Greta whispered, standing beside her. The girl reached out and touched the pillowcase. Helga, look, they gave us white sheets. Don't touch it yet. Helga snapped, though her own resolve was wavering. In the Wehrmacht, even officers in the field slept on rough wool. Here, prisoners slept on percale. She moved to the foot of the bed where a small kit had been laid out. A toothbrush, a tube of paste, a towel, and a rectangular bar of reddish soap that smelled medicinal and strong. Lifebuoy, the wrapper said. Helga picked up the soap. It was heavy, solid, a luxury item. She felt a sudden, irrational spike of anger. How dare they have so much soap when her mother was washing clothes with grit and ash? Chow time! Let's go! The shout came from outside. The mess hall was an assault on the senses of a starving woman. The noise was deafening. The clatter of aluminum trays. The roar of hundreds of voices. The clang of ladles hitting metal. Helga took a tray and moved down the line. The servers were German POWs, men captured in Africa years ago. They looked healthy. Their faces filled out. Their uniforms clean. One of them, a tall man with rolled-up sleeves, slapped a ladle of stew onto her tray. Eat up, sister, he murmured in German. It's beef today. Beef. Real beef. Not horse, not rat. Helga stared at her tray as she sat down. Beside the stew sat 2 thick slices of bread. It was white, shockingly, blindingly white. It looked like cake. Around her, the other women were eating with frantic intensity, shoveling food into their mouths. Greta was tearing into the bread, her eyes closed in ecstasy. Helga picked up the bread. It was soft, spongy. She took a bite. It dissolved on her tongue, sweet and airy. It tasted of nothing and everything. It tasted of victory. She swallowed, and the food hit her empty stomach like a stone. A wave of nausea washed over her, not from the quality of the food, but from the guilt. Every calorie she consumed felt like a betrayal of the starving Reich. Eat, Helga, Greta said, her mouth full. Please, you need strength. Helga forced herself to finish. She ate the beef. She ate the canned peaches in syrup. She drank the cold milk. With every bite, she hated the Americans more for making her need this. That night, the barracks were quiet, save for the settling of the wooden beams and the distant hum of a generator. The lights were out. Helga lay on the spring mattress, staring at the dark ceiling. The sheets were cool against her skin, a comfort she hadn't known in years. A rustle from the next bunk broke her concentration. Helga, it was Greta again. Her voice was thin, laced with panic. Helga turned her head. What is it? Are you sick from the food? No, Greta whispered. It's the date. I checked the calendar in the mess hall. So? I started, Greta said, the shame audible even in the dark. Just now. And Helga, I have nothing. I checked the kit. There is nothing for this. Helga closed her eyes, the comfort of the mattress instantly forgotten. The reality of their situation came crashing back. They were well-fed, clean, and resting on springs. But they were women in a male military machine. Go to sleep, Helga whispered, her mind already racing, calculating. Use your extra socks for tonight. I will fix it in the morning. The morning sun hit the white barracks with a cheerful brilliance that mocked the misery inside. For Helga, the camp had transformed from a gilded cage into a sanitized torture chamber. She spent the first hour of the day on a covert reconnaissance mission. While the other women polished their boots or straightened their bunks, Helga slipped behind the latrine block to check the trash cans. In Germany, trash was a resource. A discarded newspaper could be insulation, toilet paper, or sanitary padding. Here, the galvanized steel cans were empty. They had been emptied at dawn by a truck that whisked the refuse away to some unknown incinerator. There was no paper, no cardboard, no rags. Helga returned to the bathroom. Greta was waiting in the third stall, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "The socks are ruined," Greta whispered through the crack in the door. Helga clenched her jaw. The Americans had engineered a world of perfect disposability. Their toilet paper was soft, designed for comfort, not utility. It was useless for their current crisis. "Stay there," Helga ordered. "Do not move until I return." She marched back to her bunk. The barracks were empty now, most of the women assigned to cleaning duty in the mess hall. Helga knelt by her bed and pulled the heavy, olive-drab blanket down. It was U.S. Army-issue dense, scratchy wool, smelling faintly of mothballs. It was the only fabric she had access to. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the jagged shard of ceramic she had carried since France. It was her weapon, intended for a final act of defiance. Now, it would be used for something far more mundane and desperate. With trembling hands, she began to saw at the corner of the blanket. The wool was incredibly strong. It resisted the dull edge of the pottery. Helga gritted her teeth, sawing harder, sweat pricking at her hairline. She tore a long, jagged strip from the bottom hem, praying the inspection officers wouldn't notice the missing inches. She divided the strip into 2 rough squares. The fabric was thick and abrasive against her palms. It would be like sandpaper against their most sensitive skin. "It will have to do," she muttered. She returned to the latrine and slid 1 square under the stall door to Greta. "Use this. Wash the socks in the sink when the coast is clear." Helga kept the 2nd square for herself. She could feel the heaviness in her own body now, the inevitable arrival of the cycle. She retreated to a stall and positioned the coarse wool. It was bulky, uncomfortable, and chafed immediately. It felt like punishment. The day passed in a blur of physical discomfort. Walking was an ordeal. The wool shifted and rubbed, a constant, raw reminder of their degradation. Helga watched the American guards patrolling the fence. They looked so clean, their uniforms crisp. Did their women back home wear wool rags? Unlikely. They probably had access to layers of soft cotton, or perhaps they simply didn't bleed. Night fell, bringing a drop in temperature. Helga lay stiffly in her bunk, afraid to toss or turn. The fear of leakage was a childhood terror, resurrected in adulthood. In the field, surrounded by mud and death, no one cared about a stain on a uniform. But here, in this pristine, white world of chrome and bleach, a stain was an act of vandalism. She drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of snow. White, endless snow that slowly turned crimson under her boots. Helga woke with a start. The morning whistle was blowing a sharp, piercing shriek that signaled the start of the 0600 routine. She sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. As she stood, she felt a sudden, cold dampness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She turned to look at the bed. The evidence was undeniable. On the pristine, snow-white sheet that she had marveled at 2 days ago, there was a dark, spreading bloom of red. It was stark, violent. Helga stood frozen, the ceramic shard in her pocket feeling suddenly heavy and useless. She could hide a weapon. She could hide her hatred. But she could not hide this. The sound of heavy boots echoed on the wooden porch outside. The door swung open. "Inspection," a voice boomed. "Stand by your bunks." Helga backed against her bed, her hands instinctively going behind her to cover the stain. But it was no use. The white sheet screamed her secret to the entire room. The barracks door slammed against the wall, vibrating in its frame. Helga stood rigid, her heels together, her back straight, attempting to use her own body as a shield against the inevitable discovery. Behind her, the crimson stain on the white sheet felt like it was burning a hole through the air, radiating heat and shame. Lieutenant Miller walked down the center aisle. She was a tall woman with sharp features and hair tucked severely under her cap. Her uniform was immaculate, creased so sharply it looked like it could cut paper. She moved with the terrifying efficiency of someone who tolerated no disorder. "Attention," the guard barked. The 20 women in the room froze. Miller began her inspection at the far end. She didn't shout. She simply walked, her eyes scanning the floor for dust, checking the tension of the blankets. Occasionally, she would stop, run a gloved finger along a bed frame, and check for grit. Helga's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the Wehrmacht, an infraction like damaging equipment or soiling uniforms could result in a week of half rations or standing guard in the snow. But here, in this strange land of plenty, Helga feared something worse. She feared they would use her filth as proof of German inferiority. Miller moved closer. She stopped at Greta's bunk, straightened a pillow, and moved on. Then, she was in front of Helga. Helga stared straight ahead, fixing her eyes on a knot in the wooden wall behind the lieutenant. She could smell Miller, a scent of starch, peppermint, and rubbing alcohol. "Step aside, 408, Miller said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Helga hesitated for a fraction of a second, her instinct screaming to protect her dignity. "I said, step aside." Helga took one step to the right. Miller looked at the bed, her eyes locked onto the dark red bloom in the center of the pristine white sheet. The silence that followed was absolute. The other prisoners held their breath. Miller didn't recoil. She didn't grimace in disgust. She leaned forward, inspecting the stain with clinical detachment. Then, her gaze traveled to the foot of the bed. She noticed the hem of the olive-drab wool blanket. The jagged, sawed-off edge where Helga had cut her makeshift rag was painfully obvious. Miller reached out and lifted the blanket. She rubbed the rough, sawed edge between her thumb and forefinger. "Destruction of government property," Miller stated, her voice low. She dropped the blanket and looked at Helga. Her eyes were blue, cold, and unreadable. "And unsanitary conditions. There. And Helga started, her throat dry. "I had no choice. There was nothing provided." "Silence," the guard near the door shouted. Miller held up a hand to silence the guard. She looked Helga up and down, noting the tension in the prisoner's posture, the defensive tilt of her chin. "You cut a U.S. Army blanket," Miller said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Do you know the penalty for destroying military assets?" Helga swallowed. "I expect punishment, Lieutenant." Miller stared at her for a long moment. In that gaze, Helga saw a flicker of something that wasn't anger. It was confusion. Perhaps even pity. The lieutenant pulled a small notebook from her pocket and scribbled something down. The scratching of the pencil sounded like thunder in the quiet room. She snapped the notebook shut. "Strip the bed," Miller ordered. "Put the sheets in the laundry bin. Then report to the infirmary immediately." Helga felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The infirmary. Rumors had circulated on the ship about American doctors performing experiments on prisoners, injecting them with diseases to test new cures. "Am I to be punished there?" Helga asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Miller didn't answer the question. She turned on her heel and marched toward the door. "Move. 408. Don't make me wait. Move. 408. Move." Helga grabbed the soiled sheet, bunching it up to hide the stain, her face burning. As she walked past Greta, the young girl reached out a hand, her eyes wide with terror. Helga, Greta whispered. Stay here, Helga commanded softly. Don't do anything foolish. She followed the lieutenant out into the bright morning sunlight, clutching the bundle of white linen to her chest like a dead child. She walked toward the white building with the red cross painted on the roof, convinced she was walking toward her end. The infirmary was a blinding expanse of white enamel and polished chrome. The air here was different from the barracks. It was sharper, colder, smelling of ether, and strict discipline. Helga stood in the center of the room, clutching her elbows, her eyes darting to the glass cabinets lining the walls. Inside, she saw rows of gleaming steel instruments, scalpels, forceps, syringes. She felt a cold sweat prickle beneath her collar. The stories whispered in the bunkers of Berlin came flooding back, stories of enemies who experimented on prisoners to test chemical tolerances. Lieutenant Miller stood with her back to Helga, rummaging through a tall supply cabinet. The clinking of glass against metal made Helga flinch. Sit, Miller said, pointing to a stool without turning around. Helga sat on the very edge, her muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. Lieutenant, regarding the blanket, I will accept solitary confinement. But please, no. She gestured vaguely at the cabinets. No. Procedures. Miller paused. She turned slowly, holding a clipboard. A frown creased her forehead. Procedures? What are you talking about? I am healthy, Helga insisted, her voice rising slightly. I do not need injections. Miller stared at her. And then, for the first time, the severe lines of her face softened into something resembling exhaustion. You think I dragged you here to stick you with a needle because you ruined a blanket? She shook her head. A short, dry exhale of air. We aren't monsters. 408. I brought you here because you're bleeding all over my barracks. Miller turned back to the cabinet. She reached up to a high shelf, bypassing the medicines and the bandages. She pulled down a square cardboard box wrapped in blue paper. She tossed it onto the metal examination table. It landed with a soft thud. Helga stared at it. It was a commercial package, pristine and untouched. Printed on the side in bold, dark blue letters was a single word, Kotex. Below it, smaller text read, Disposable sanitary napkins. Miller wasn't finished. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a strange apparatus, a loop of pinkish elastic with dangling white tabs and metal clips. She dropped this next to the box. Take them, Miller said. Helga looked from the objects to the nurse's face, utterly bewildered. I do not understand. What is this? Supplies, Miller said, tapping the box. Standard issue for WACs and nurses. We have extra crates of them in logistics. Since you ladies arrived without essentials, the colonel authorized the distribution. Helga reached out tentatively and touched the blue box. It felt solid. Real. She opened the flap. Inside, layers of soft, white gauze were visible. Pure cotton, clean cellulose. In Germany, cotton was for gunshot wounds. It was for the front lines. To use such material for a woman's monthly cycle was a waste so extravagant it bordered on madness. And here was a whole box. 12 of them. For me? Helga whispered. For you. And take a case for the others in your unit, Miller said, writing on her clipboard again. And 408? Don't cut up any more army property. Next time, I will put you in the brig. Helga stood up, gathering the blue box and the elastic belt. The objects felt alien in her hands. The belt looked like a miniature parachute harness. The pads looked like surgical dressings. She felt a surge of vertigo. She had braced herself for cruelty, for a fight. She had not braced herself for a gift of hygiene. It disarmed her completely. Thank you, Helga managed to say, the English words feeling heavy and inadequate. Dismissed, Miller said, already moving on to check a thermometer in a jar. Helga walked out of the infirmary and back into the bright sunlight of the camp yard. The wind tugged at her skirt. She looked down at the blue box in her hands. It was a treasure. A brick of gold. But as she looked at the elastic belt with its confusing metal teeth and loops, the relief began to fade, replaced by a new, sinking realization. She had the technology of the victors in her hands, but she had absolutely no idea how to assemble it. Helga entered the barracks with the cardboard box tucked under her arm like a classified dossier. The chatter inside died down instantly. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the blue package. "What is it?" Greta asked, sitting up on her bunk. She was still pale, holding a wad of toilet paper against her stomach. "Supplies," Helga announced. She placed the box on the nearest empty cot. The women gathered around, their curiosity overriding their exhaustion. Helga opened the flap of the box. She pulled out one of the pads. It was a long, rectangular brick of compressed cotton, encased in a tube of gauze that extended several inches beyond the cotton at both ends. "It's soft," a woman named Liesel whispered, reaching out to stroke the surface. "Like a cloud." "And this?" Helga said, producing the pink elastic belt. She held it up. It dangled in the air, a confusing web of straps and metal teeth. "What is that?" Greta asked, frowning. "A harness? Are we parachuting?" "It goes with the cotton," Helga explained, though her voice lacked conviction. "Lieutenant Miller gave them to me together." The women stared at the objects. In Germany, before the war shortages, they had used washable knitted pads that buttoned into special undergarments, or simply layers of cloth pinned to a girdle. But this American invention was different. There were no buttons. There were no safety pins provided. Just the elastic loop and the sliding metal grips. "Maybe you just stuff it in?" Liesel suggested. "Don't be absurd," Helga snapped. "It would fall out in 10 steps. Look at the ends of the gauze. They are long for a reason." Greta picked up the belt. She stretched the elastic. "Maybe it goes over the shoulder?" "It's too small for that," Helga said. She took the belt back and examined the metal clasp. It had teeth, like a small trap. She tried to force the gauze end of the pad into the teeth, but the gauze was too thick, and the teeth didn't seem to bite down. The frustration in the room began to mount. Here was the solution to their most humiliating problem. Clean, sterile, absorbent, and it was locked behind a barrier of cultural ignorance. They were engineers, radio operators, nurses. They had operated complex signal machinery and calculated artillery trajectories. Yet, they were defeated by a feminine hygiene product from Chicago. "We should cut the ends off," a younger girl suggested, reaching for the scissors in the sewing kit. "Just use the cotton part." "No. No." Helga grabbed her wrist. "We do not destroy them. If we ruin these, we get nothing else. We go back to the rags." 2. The room fell silent. The blue box sat on the bed, mocking them. Helga felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. It wasn't just frustration. It was a deep, burning inadequacy. The Americans had industrialized everything, even this. They had made a science out of comfort. By not knowing how to use it, Helga felt like a barbarian standing at the gates of Rome, unable to understand a fork. She looked at Greta, who was curling in on herself, clearly in pain and worried about leaking onto the new sheets. "I will find out," Helga said, her voice steel. "How?" Greta asked. "I will ask." "Ask who? The guards?" Liesel looked horrified. "No," Helga said. She picked up one pad and the belt, hiding them in the fold of her skirt. "I will ask the lieutenant." "Helga." "You can't," Greta whispered. "It's humiliating. To ask an enemy officer how to dress yourself? It is more humiliating to bleed on their floor, Helga retorted. She straightened her jacket, smoothing the wrinkles. I am a German officer. I will treat this as a technical inquiry, nothing more. She turned and marched out of the barracks, head held high. But inside, her stomach was churning. Asking for food was survival. Asking for mercy was weakness. Asking for instruction on her own anatomy felt like a total surrender of dignity. She crossed the compound yard, the gravel crunching under her boots. The infirmary door loomed ahead. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cool spring air, steeling herself. She knocked on the doorframe. Come in, Miller's voice called out. Helga stepped inside. The lieutenant was washing her hands at the sink. She glanced in the mirror and saw Helga standing there, the pink elastic belt dangling limply from her hand. Back so soon, 408? Miller dried her hands on a paper towel. Forget something? Helga closed the door behind her. She looked at the American woman. Then, down at the baffling object in her hand. I require, Helga started, then stopped. She cleared her throat, forcing the words out. I require instruction on the mechanism. Miller looked at Helga, then at the dangling belt. A flicker of realization crossed the American woman's face, followed quickly by a softening around the eyes that Helga found more disarming than a weapon. Come with me, Miller said quietly. She led Helga to the small, private latrine attached to the rear of the infirmary. It was a narrow space, smelling of pine disinfectant and the sharp, metallic tang of rust from the pipes. It was the exact place Helga had dreaded, yet now it felt like a sanctuary. Miller closed the door, leaving them in the intimate, tiled silence. She took the belt from Helga's hand and the blue box. She opened the box and removed a fresh pad. It's not a puzzle. 408. It's just engineering, Miller said. Her tone was matter-of-fact, stripping the situation of its potential shame. Miller held up the elastic belt. You see these metal tabs? They have teeth, but you don't just jam the cotton in. She held the pad up, demonstrating in the air. The gauze extends past the cotton. These are the tails. You fold the tail, she mimed, folding the long end of the gauze. And you slide it through the loop, then pull the metal tab down to lock it, like a suspender clip. Helga watched, mesmerized. It was ingenious. In Germany, everything was tied with strings or held with buttons that inevitably popped off. This was a system designed for security, designed so a woman could move, march, or work without fear. Here, Miller said, handing the items back. You try. I'll step out. Helga stood alone in the stall. Her hands trembled as she replicated the motion. She pulled the elastic belt up her legs. It was snug, fitting firmly against her hips. She took the pad soft, pristine, smelling of absolutely nothing, and threaded the gauze tail through the metal loop. Click. The metal tab snapped down, biting into the gauze, holding it fast. She repeated it on the back. Click. It was secure. It held the soft cotton perfectly in place against her body. Helga stood there for a moment, breathing in the pine-scented air. For the last 3 days, she had been walking with a wad of scratchy, dirty wool shoved into her underwear, terrified it would shift, terrified it would fall, terrified it would stain. Every step had been a calculation. Now, she took a step, then another. The pad moved with her. It was soft. It was comfortable. It was safe. She adjusted her skirt and flushed the toilet not to dispose of anything, but to cover the sound of her own ragged breathing. She washed her hands at the small sink, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted behind the eyes. She opened the door. Miller was leaning against the wall, checking her clipboard. Work out okay? Miller asked, not looking up. Yes, Helga said. The English word felt insufficient. The mechanism. It is efficient. Miller looked up then, a faint smile touching her lips. American know-how. We like to keep things practical. She paused, her gaze lingering on Helga's face. You tell the other girls? Show them how the tabs work. I don't want to have to give 20 private lessons today. I will show them, Helga promised. Good. And 408? Miller lowered her voice. Take a few extra bars of soap from the bin on your way out. For the laundry. Helga stiffened. That was against regulations. That was theft. Or was it grace? She walked to the bin and took 3 bars of the red Lifebuoy soap. She slipped them into her pocket alongside the blue box. Thank you, Lieutenant, Helga said. Go on, get out of here. Miller waved her off. Helga walked back across the compound. The gravel crunched under her boots, but her stride was longer now, more confident. She wasn't just a prisoner of war anymore. She was a woman who had been given back a piece of her humanity by the very people she was sworn to hate. She clutched the blue box tight. Inside the barracks, the women were waiting, anxious and uncomfortable. Helga pushed the door open. Gather round, she announced, her voice clear and strong. I have cracked the code. She set the box down on the bed, not as contraband, but as a victory. Helga stood at the center of the barracks, the aisle between the bunks transformed into a makeshift lecture hall. 20 women watched her with intense fascination as she held up the pink elastic belt. The metal tab is a locking mechanism, Helga explained, demonstrating the motion with practiced ease. You fold the gauze tail. You insert it here. You snap it shut. It does not slip. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the group. It was a simple mechanical solution to a biological problem. But in that moment, it seemed like a miracle of engineering. Come, Helga ordered. Take a box. Take a belt. The women moved forward, eager hands reaching for the blue packages stacked on Helga's cot. The tension that had gripped the room for days, the fear of stains, the smell of unwashed bodies, the irritability began to evaporate. Stop. The command cracked through the room like a whip. Ilsa, a senior signal auxiliary who still wore her Iron Cross ribbon pinned to her dirty tunic, stood by the door. Her face was twisted in a sneer. Do not touch them, Ilsa hissed. It is a trick. The women froze, hands hovering over the boxes. It is cotton, Ilsa, Greta said, clutching a box to her chest. It is just cotton. It is a bribe, Ilsa marched forward, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. She pointed a shaking finger at the blue boxes. First the white bread, then the hot water. Now this? They are trying to buy your souls with luxury. They want you soft. They want you to forget who you are, so you will betray the fatherland. She turned to Helga, her eyes burning with fanaticism. And you, Helga, you are their lackey now, distributing their gifts like a collaborator? The room fell into a terrified silence. The accusation of collaboration was a dangerous one, even in captivity. It carried the weight of treason. Helga did not flinch. She looked at Ilsa, then down at the blue box in her own hand. She thought of the jagged piece of ceramic in her pocket, the weapon she had carried to kill herself. She thought of the rough wool rag that had chafed her skin raw. And she thought of Lieutenant Miller's hands clean, efficient, offering help without asking for a confession. Look at us, Ilsa, Helga said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Look at your uniform. It is covered in grime. You smell of sweat and old blood. Is this the glory of the Reich? We suffer for the cause. Ilsa spat. We rot for nothing, Helga countered, stepping closer. The war is lost. You know it. I know it. The Americans. They have so much cotton they wrap it in disposable paper and give it to their prisoners. While our leaders told us to boil rags. Helga picked up a box and shoved it into Ilsa's chest. The other woman stumbled back, but caught it instinctively. This is not collaboration, Helga said firmly. This is survival. You want to fight? Fine. But you cannot fight if you die of infection. You cannot maintain discipline if you are humiliated by your own body every month. She looked around at the other women. We use their food to build our strength. We use their soap to wash our skin. And we use this. She tapped the blue box. To keep our dignity. We survive. We go home. That is how we win. Ilse stared at the box in her hands. She looked at the bold Kotex lettering. Her thumb brushed the smooth cardboard. The fanaticism in her eyes wavered, replaced by the sheer, exhausted reality of being a woman in a prison camp. Slowly, Ilse's shoulders slumped. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked back to her bunk, clutching the box. The spell was broken. The sound that followed was not the sound of marching or orders. It was the sound of tearing cardboard and crinkling paper. It was the sound of relief. Helga sat on her bunk and watched. The atmosphere in the barracks shifted physically. The sharp, anxious edge was gone. Women were smiling tentatively. Someone began to hum a tune, not a march, but a folk song. Later that afternoon, the change manifested in the room itself. With the immediate physical crisis averted, the women turned their attention outward. They began to tidy their personal spaces with renewed vigor. Greta returned from the yard, her hands cupped together. Look, she whispered to Helga. In her hands were a dozen yellow dandelions, weeds plucked from the edge of the neatly mowed lawn. I found a jar, Greta said. She filled an empty peach can with water and arranged the weeds in it. She placed it on the small table in the center of the room. The bright yellow flowers stood out against the stark white and gray of the barracks. Helga lay back on her pillow, the clean, secure feeling of the American supplies making her body feel light. She looked at the flowers, then at the blue box sitting on her nightstand. The enemy had conquered them with tanks and planes, yes, but they were taming them with cotton and empathy. And for the first time, Helga wondered if that was such a terrible thing. Sunday in the camp arrived not with a bugle call, but with a strange, heavy stillness. The usual roar of trucks from the logistics depot was muted, and the spring air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and damp earth, overriding the chemical tang of disinfectant. Inside Barracks 4, the mood was solemn. For the first time since their capture, the women were not frantically scrubbing floors or mending uniforms. They were preparing. Helga stood by her bunk, smoothing the collar of her gray blouse. She looked around the room. It was a small detail, invisible to any male guard, but to her, it was monumental. The women stood straighter. There was no shifting of weight, no nervous checking of skirts, no subtle grimaces of discomfort. The supplies from the blue boxes had done their work. By securing their bodies, the Americans had inadvertently freed their minds. Are we ready? Greta asked. She had braided her hair, weaving a few of the yellow dandelions into the plaits. Yes, Helga said. Assemble by the window. They gathered in a semicircle. There was no chaplain, no altar, only the patch of sunlight falling on the floorboards. Outside, near the perimeter fence, a young American corporal sat on an overturned crate, his rifle resting against his knee. He was reading a newspaper. Helga could see the bold headline even from a distance. Local outrage. Are we coddling the enemy? She had seen similar cartoons in the trash bins, caricatures of German prisoners eating steak while American boys died in the Pacific. She knew the tension that simmered outside these gates. To the public, every calorie fed to Helga and her unit was an insult to their own rationing. But inside the wire, the rules were different. We will sing Grosser Gott, wir loben dich, Helga announced softly. It is a hymn they will know. It exists in English too. Ilse nodded, her face stripped of its usual bitterness. She clasped her hands together. They began to sing. At first, their voices were thin, raspy from weeks of disuse and fear. But as the melody took hold, the sound swelled. It was a rich, harmonic chorus of 20 women, rising up into the rafters and drifting out through the screen windows. Großer Gott, wir loben dich, Herr, wir preisen deine Stärke. Helga closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the music wash over her. For months, her mind had been a fortress of survival calculations. Food, warmth, hygiene, defense. Now, surrounded by the scent of soap and the sound of faith, she felt the fortress walls crumbling. She remembered Sunday mornings in Cologne before the bombs fell. She remembered being a daughter, not a soldier. When she opened her eyes, she looked out the window. The young corporal had lowered his newspaper. He was looking at the barracks, his expression unreadable. Further back, leaning against the hood of a jeep, stood Lieutenant Miller. She was smoking a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily into the blue sky. She wasn't watching with the hawk-like scrutiny of an inspector. Her head was tilted slightly, listening. Helga held the lieutenant's gaze across the yard. There was no hatred there. There was only a quiet recognition of a shared ritual. In that moment, the barbed wire seemed to fade. They were just women, separated by politics but connected by the universal language of melody and the shared vulnerability of the human condition. The hymn ended on a high, clear note that hung in the air for a long heartbeat. "Amen," Greta whispered. "Amen," the room echoed. They stood in silence, the peace of the moment wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Suddenly, the door to the barracks swung open. The spell broke. The corporal stood there, looking flustered. He didn't have his rifle. "Officer on deck," he shouted, but his voice lacked the usual bark. Lieutenant Miller stepped in behind him. She looked different today. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face was pale. She held a piece of teletype paper in her hand. The women snapped to attention, fear instantly returning. Had the singing offended them? Was the newspaper right? Were they about to be punished to appease the angry public? Miller looked at them, her eyes moving from Helga to Ilse to Greta. She took a deep breath. "At ease," Miller said quietly. She looked down at the paper, then back up at Helga. "I thought you should know," Miller said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We just got the wire from headquarters. It's over." Helga frowned. "Lieutenant? Germany has surrendered unconditionally," Miller said. "The war in Europe. It's finished." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Helga felt her knees weaken. She reached out and gripped the metal frame of her bunk to steady herself. Finished. The Third Reich. The 1,000-year empire. The cause for which they had marched and bled and starved, it was gone. Smoke and ash. A sob broke out from the back of the room. Then another. It wasn't a cheer. It was a sound of profound, shattering grief, mixed with an unbearable relief. Helga looked at Miller. The American nurse nodded once, a gesture of soldier-to-soldier acknowledgement, then turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her, leaving them to mourn the world that was dead and face the terrifying prospect of the one that was just beginning. March 1946. The wind sweeping across the Maryland plains felt different than it had the year before. It no longer carried the bite of a strange, hostile winter, but the scent of thawing earth and impending departure. Inside the barracks, the mood was a disquieting mix of relief and terror. The repatriation orders had finally come. They were going home. But home was no longer the proud city of stone and history they had left. According to the newspapers and the newsreels shown in the mess hall, home was a landscape of craters, ash, and skeletal hunger. Helga stood before her cot, staring at the open canvas duffel bag. It was a U.S. Army surplus bag, stamped with black letters. Into it, she had packed her few possessions: her gray uniform, now washed and mended, a pair of sturdy boots, and a sketchbook she had filled with drawings of the American countryside. She looked at the small bedside table. Sitting there were her remaining treasures: 3 bars of red Lifebuoy soap, smelling intensely of carbolic acid, and 2 unopened blue boxes of Kotex, along with a handful of loose pads she had scavenged and saved over the months. "You are taking them?" Greta asked from the next bunk. The girl looked healthier now, her cheeks rounder, her hair shiny. She was packing a chocolate bar wrapped in foil. "Of course," Helga said softly. "In Berlin, these will be worth more than diamonds." She picked up the blue boxes with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. She thought of her mother and her younger sister, Trudy. She imagined them in the cellar of their ruined apartment building, boiling old rags, scraping by in the filth of defeat. Helga wrapped the blue boxes carefully in her spare undershirt to protect them from being crushed. She tucked them deep into the center of the bag, surrounded by the softness of the wool. These were not just sanitary supplies. They were gifts of dignity. They were a promise to her family that civilization still existed somewhere in the world, and that she had brought a piece of it back to them. She placed the heavy bars of soap on top. The smell would permeate her clothes, a lingering scent of the enemy's hygiene that she would carry into the rubble of the Reich. "Line up, transport is here." The shout came from the door. Helga zipped the bag shut. She hefted it onto her shoulder. It was heavy, but she felt strong enough to carry it. She was not the emaciated, terrified creature who had stumbled off the boat in Boston. She was fed. She was rested. She was clean. She walked out of the barracks for the last time. The sun was blindingly bright. A convoy of trucks waited to take them to the train station, and then to the ship that would ferry them back across the Atlantic. As she climbed into the back of the truck, she looked toward the administration building. Standing on the porch, watching the prisoners load up, was Lieutenant Miller. The American nurse was not smiling, nor was she gloating. She stood with her hands in her pockets, a silent sentinel witnessing the end of their strange, shared chapter. Helga did not wave. Such a gesture would have been too casual, too friendly for the complex history between them. Instead, she straightened her back and gave a single, slow nod. Miller returned the nod, acknowledged. The engine roared to life, spewing a cloud of exhaust. The truck lurched forward, rolling past the manicured lawns, the white-painted barracks, and the high wire fences that had been their home. Helga watched the camp recede into the distance. She touched the pocket of her coat. The sharp shard of ceramic she had carried for so long was gone. She had thrown it into the latrine trash can that morning. She didn't need a weapon to kill herself anymore. She wanted to live. She looked at her hands, resting on her knees. They were not cracked or stained with soot. The nails were clean. The Americans had bombed her cities and destroyed her government. But in this strange, quiet corner of the war, they had conquered her hatred by giving her a bed with springs, bread as white as clouds, and a blue box that allowed her to walk with her head held high. The truck turned onto the main road, picking up speed. Helga took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean American air one last time before turning her face toward the east, toward the ruins, toward the future.